it time for the United Kingdom to cede its seat at the United Nations Security Council for India, which is not yet a permanent member? That's the argument made by leading public intellectual, author, and former diplomat Kishore Mahbubani. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our focus today on the program is to look at the very interesting and provocative column by Mr. Mahbubani in the Financial Times that argues that the credibility of the United Nations depends very much on whether it is able to adjust to shifting global powers. Kishore Mahbubani, who has also been at one point the president of the United Nations Security Council and has been a diplomat for Singapore alongside a leading academic and public intellectual, argues that for the UN to retain its credibility, it is absolutely bizarre that a country like India does not have a permanent spot at the UNSC. In fact, he goes on to argue that you can do a comparative sort of a look at the economies, the projected economies and the economic growth of the United Kingdom and India, and you will find your own answer as to which country deserves a spot at the global high table. He's spoken in particular in many conversations since about how Modi has been able to some extent, walk the trapeze walk between Russia and Ukraine, asking which other country can possibly do that. It's a very provocative argument. And at the same time, Mr. Mahbubani has also argued in his memoirs about this being the Asian century. But there is the intractable problem, what Jaishankar recently called India's unique China problem, to consider when we talk about whether this is indeed an Asia century. Let's introduce our newsmaker on the program today. Kishore Mahbubani is with us. It's great to have him with us. We've been trying to slot this conversation for a long time. Kishore, if I may address you that way. Let me start by asking you to talk a little bit about your FT argument. The UN is going to be irrelevant if it does not adjust to shifting global powers. India very clearly is a global power, more of a global power, an emerging global power compared to the United Kingdom. While that would be a supreme moment of decolonization, how do you build your case?
Well, I make the case very simply on the grounds that the founding fathers of the UN made a very wise decision that the only way to ensure that the UN survives is to ensure that the great powers of the day have a vested interest in staying in the UN. And that's why they created the notion of the veto that gives a special privilege to the great powers, and that gives them a stake in the UN, and that's why they stay there. And that's the reason why the United States has not left the United Nations, as it previously, refused to join the League of Nations in the early 20th century. So that was a very wise move to create the veto rights. But the veto rights was intended not for the great powers of yesterday. They didn't give it to the great powers of yesterday in 1945, but for the great powers of today and the great powers of tomorrow. And credibly, on the basis of, objective data, I'm not anti-British, I'm not anti-UK, I'm not doing this because I'm pro-India or whatsoever. I'm doing this with the interest of the world, with the global, with the humanity in mind. We need a functioning UN Security Council. And the functioning UN Security Council must have the great powers of today. And India clearly has surpassed UK very comprehensively as a great power. And so clearly India is a much more deserving of a seat in the UN Security Council than the UK is today. And frankly, from the UK's point of view, given its domestic problems, domestic challenges, it'd be wiser for the UK to focus on its domestic challenges, and then we tell India, why don't you have a try and see whether or not you can manage the world better than we can.
But Kishore, you know that nobody ever gives up a seat at the table, right? So while this sounds like a great argument, I possibly can't see the United Kingdom actually saying, okay, this is not our place, India deserves it more. In that case, A, can you ever see this becoming a reality? And B, if it doesn't happen, if the UN doesn't actually readapt itself to the changing realities of a new world order, what happens to the United Nations?
Well, I think, as you know, I said in my Financial Times article very clearly that this is not going to happen overnight. In fact, I suggested perhaps it could happen in 2027 on the 80th anniversary of India's independence from the UK. That would be a good time for this to happen. But remember, at the end of the day, the UN Security Council also has to worry about its own credibility and its own standing in the world. If the world begins to perceive that the UN Security Council no longer has the great powers of today as permanent members, then the UN Security Council will lose its credibility as an organization. So the P5 will have to choose between the credibility and the composition. To keep the credibility, they have to change the composition, and this will just be the first step. Subsequently, you'll have to get Brazil in, and certainly an African country in also. But I see this as a first step towards solving a fundamental problem for the UN Security Council, because it will lose its credibility if it doesn't have the great powers of today and tomorrow among its permanent members.
One of the points that you've made is that if this doesn't happen, you could also see a situation where a country like India might stop paying heed to UNSC resolutions or decision making altogether.
Well, that's precisely why they're given the veto, because the founding fathers of the UN knew that if you don't include the great power in the decision making, and the great power decides, I'm not going to abide by your decisions. And India is now big enough, strong enough to say, tell the UN Security Council, why should I abide by your decisions? Who gave you the authority to pass judgment on me? And essentially, what the current order is, when you give the UK the veto and you don't give India the veto, you're basically saying that UK, a smaller, obviously less significant country, can decide what India should do. Now that's wrong. I mean, that's a reversal of how international relations have worked. So realistically, you have to bring India into the fold as quickly as possible into the UN Security Council. And I'm arguing that this is the right thing for the UN and the right thing for the world.
Now, is your argument basis the size of the economy or the projected economy or the economic growth for India? You quote a Goldman Sachs report to contrast the projected growths between India and the United Kingdom. I think it's 5 trillion to, I think you say 18 trillion, which is what the Goldman Sachs report projects by 2025, if I'm quoting you correctly. But is your argument based entirely on the economics of India vis-a-vis UK, or is it also, as you've mentioned, in a way the historicity of India's unique position in the world? For example, you have spoken about the Prime Minister going to Russia as his first bilateral and then heading towards Ukraine to meet with Zelensky. Yes, there are two opinions on whether that trip went so well. Zelensky seemed very angry, but talk a little bit about why that was so illustrative for you to make the argument that you're making.
By the way, a small correction. It should be India will be much bigger, 18 trillion versus UK's 5 trillion in 2050, and not next year, not 2025.
Yes, we'll correct that. We'll correct that. We'll correct
very,
it.
very,
Sorry,
very
that's our
important,
mistake.
very important point. But
Yeah.
the key point
Yeah.
here is that it should be based on comprehensive national strength. And the comprehensive national strength is then shown in the amount of respect that that country gets. I mean, as you know, India today, more leaders surely want to visit India and meet Prime Minister Modi than to go to UK and meet prime ministers like Boris Johnson, who's, as you know, is a joker, and his successor Liz Truss was a joke, right? It is therefore it's the comprehensive national strength of the country lifts up the stature of the leader, and that's why Prime Minister Modi can now go to Moscow and go to Kiev, and everyone receives him with great respect. That's an indication of how far India has come. And also that also means that India, given its size and its influence, can become a more powerful peacemaker. And people want the great powers of the day to become peacemakers. And if India can talk to both President Putin and President Zelensky, India has the opportunity to serve as a good peacemaker on the Ukraine war. And I can assure you that most countries in the world, especially countries of the global south, who have actually suffered some of the consequences of the Ukraine war, want to see India play a bigger role in bringing peace on the Ukraine to the Ukraine war.
Yeah, so it's going to be very interesting to see how the UN shapes up. But just to pivot also to your memoirs, you have for a while argued that this is Asia's century. And unlike many people who look at India and China as adversaries, and the West has long looked at India as a countervailing force to China, your book and your memoirs look at the issue somewhat differently. And you talk about, in a way, living the Asia century. But I draw your attention to a recent comment by Foreign Minister Jay Shankar, who said that India has a unique China problem. He said the world has a China problem, but India has a very unique China problem. And he said, given the border standoff, perhaps it was time to scrutinize, it's just common sense, that's the phrase he used, to review the investments from China in India. How do you reconcile the idea of the Asia century as encapsulated in your memoirs and in
Mm.
your writings elsewhere with
Mm.
the fact that most Indians today would probably, if asked, who is more dangerous, China or Pakistan, would see China, because even though the wars have been with Pakistan, China is seen as the sort of economic behemoth. China is seen as the country capturing Indian markets. There's the big border standoff with China. You look at this headline in Indian Express, the Indian MSMEs losing ground as Chinese goods flood market. So I want you to talk a little bit about how we reconcile your
Mm.
argument with what's actually happening at the border and with the markets.
Well, you're right. We can only have the Asian century if both India and China thrive and do well. It is not going to be the Chinese century, nor is it going to be the Indian century, nor is it going to be the ASEAN century. But I do believe that the Asian century is coming because the leading Asian economies are going to do very well, have done very well, and are going to do very well. Before I respond to your question on China and India, let me just give you one statistic to illustrate how much global economic growth is coming from what I call the new CIA countries, not Central Intelligence Agency. CIA stands for China, India, ASEAN. And this is one statistic that I think Indians should hoist in. If the combined population of China, India, and ASEAN in Southeast Asia is 3.5 billion. Out of these 3.5 billion people, there were only 150 million people enjoying middle class living standards in the year 2000. Only 150 million out of 3.5 billion. But by 2020, that number had exploded 10 times to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, we're going to hit 2.5 to 3 billion. Now, never before in history have we seen such a large explosion of middle class populations. And as a result of that, much of global economic growth is going to come from the new CIA countries. But of course, it does require that the CIA countries are able to work with each other and have a happy relationship. Now, in this triangle, as you know, China and ASEAN have a good relationship. India and ASEAN have a good relationship. The troubled relationship is the one, as you mentioned, between China and India. And of course, I'm acutely aware of the challenges in the relationship and the difficulties in the relationship. But at the end of the day, I think it's also possible for China and India to sit down and find solutions for each other. And if you do a rational calculation of India's economic interests, even though India wants to be less reliant on Chinese exports, the reality is that India's destiny is to become a manufacturing power like China. Now, to become a manufacturing power, all manufacturing countries, by the way, don't manufacture everything. They get components from all over the world, and certainly, India, as you know, has been getting components from China, and will continue to get components from China as it moves up the ladder in terms of as a manufacturing power. So it may be rational for India and China to stabilize their relationship and work out a win-win partnership on the economic front, and I believe that it can be done.
Can the economic can the economic stability and partnership that you speak about be practical when there is a kind of eyeball to eyeball militarized face off in eastern Ladakh and since 2020, we're now in 2024, we have not seen any breakthrough despite multiple rounds of conversations between the two militaries, between the two countries. Now, some might argue that the kind of partnership that you're talking about, that is possible only if A, your soldiers aren't standing, your armies aren't standing eyeball to eyeball. B, there isn't this kind of skeptical perception in India that somewhere Pakistan has become somewhat of a vassal state of China. And therefore, India has security concerns on two fronts, and that China would jump to Pakistan's aid whenever necessary. You know that the UN,
Mm,
China has often blocked sanctions that India has hoped
mm,
would be brought against terror groups, for
mm,
example, like the Jamaat ul-Dawa, which is the patron group of the
mm.
Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Well, there are many countries that have challenging relations with China. And actually, the one country that has had the most challenges in its relations with China is Vietnam. Vietnam, by
Mhm.
the way, has been a neighbor of China for 2,000 years, and Vietnam was occupied by China for 1,000 years. And the
Mm.
Vietnamese have worked out a saying that to become a leader of China, you must be able to stand up to China and you must be able to get along with China. And what's interesting about this relationship between China and Vietnam is that China and Vietnam have fought a much bigger war than any
Mm.
war between China and India. There were about 1 million men fighting each other at the border. And and then, in fact, the last major war was the war between China and Vietnam at the Sino-Vietnamese border. Huge, huge, massive war, and therefore for a decade after that there were million soldiers at the border. But today, if you go to the same border, the soldiers are gone, the barbed wire is gone, and China and Vietnam today have a thriving win-win economic partnership,
Mm.
even though the Vietnamese remain incredibly suspicious and wary of China. But international relations is not a relationship that is based on friendship, it is always based on interests. And if you can calculate that your interests are better off if you work out a working partnership, then even if you dislike or distrust the country you're dealing with, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the
Mm.
day, it's what you're getting. And remember, all great powers traditionally have been very pragmatic. I mean, take the United States, for example, which has declared itself the bastion of democracy. And yet, in 1971, when the number one threat to the United States was the Soviet Union, what did United States do? It allied with Mao Zedong's China, even though it didn't approve of Mao as a democratic leader. And incidentally, in 1971, as you know, United States opposed India's liberation of Bangladesh. Why? Because United States interests were different. So at the end of the day, you must look at hardcore interests. Where do your interests lie? And India's interests clearly lie in rapid economic development. And in the face of economic development, the more economic partners you have, the faster you grow. And once India becomes an $18 trillion economy, believe me, the whole world will treat India with enormous respect. And that's what should be the goal. Focus on your
Yeah.
long-term interests and not short-term emotions.
Before we let you go, very quickly, you spoke about the United States and Bangladesh, and I think it would be in order for me to say that that circle has turned fully. We're back to a situation where India and the United States possibly have a divergent position on what's unfolding in Bangladesh. Though of course India will engage with whichever government represents the people in Bangladesh. Just a quick thought on the very turbulent South Asian neighborhood. You've spoken about China, but there's a sense in India that all around India there's turbulence.
Well, I think you're right to talk about the turbulence. And here I hope my friends in India would look at Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is a remarkable place. Out of the 10 countries in ASEAN, 9
Yeah.
have an Indic base. And
Hmm.
if Indians come to Southeast Asia, they see the Ramayana, Mahabharata perform in
Yeah.
Thailand and in Indonesia, even in Philippines during the East Asian Summit. And what's amazing is that Southeast Asia is the most diverse place in the in all of the world. And out of 700 million people, close to 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and we have lots of communists also in Southeast Asia. And guess what? In the most diverse region of planet Earth, we have created a regional organization that has enabled us to cooperate. So I would say that people of South Asia should ask themselves, why can't the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation be as effective as ASEAN? I think it can be done. And remember,
Yeah.
when I first started going, you'll see this in my memoirs, when I first started attending ASEAN meetings in 1971, there was tremendous distrust in the room. You could smell the distrust when you walk into the meetings. That's just like in South Asia, but it can go away. It can be changed. That's the message from ASEAN.
Well, it's been fascinating, Kishore, both your column and your memoirs and this conversation. Do pick up a copy of Mr. Mahbubani's book and have a look at his column in the Financial Times if you haven't. Thank you, Kishore Mahbubani. Always a pleasure. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.